Well, hey you guys. Time once again for another Tomes of Terror, my little book review series. So, I remember hearing a shit ton about Catriona Ward's novel, The Last House on Needless Street, back when it came out back in, I think it was autumn of 2021. There was a really lot of buzz about it in the horror community. And I also read that the movie rights got snapped up pretty quickly, so I don't know what's happening with that, though. I don't know if they're going to make a movie out of it eventually. I'm obviously a little late to the party here, as usual, because I will say that, like, even though the cover looked really cool and the brief synopsis of the book that I read sounded kind of intriguing, I actually didn't get around to reading it until it showed up on my Kindle Unlimited recommendations for free because, I'm kind of a cheap bitch like that. I hate to tell you. So now, somehow, I managed to avoid any spoilers or like in-depth plot synopses or anything like that in the 2 years since this book came out. And I'm actually really glad I did, as I usually am, because I feel like this is yet another case of the story being much better if you don't know exactly what you're in for. Now, that said, this novel has a pretty big twist, I guess, that I'm not going to spoil, and that if astute readers may actually be able to guess it. It also has several unreliable narrators, I will go that far. And I will say that it also kind of like utilizes a trope that has been done in horror stories and in thrillers several times before. Now, I didn't actually mind this. I didn't mind the reveal, and some other readers seem to like it as well because this is, like, largely a pretty well-reviewed book. But I did notice that some reviewers absolutely hated it, so your mileage is going to vary on this, just like pretty much everything else. But just know that going in. Now, the narrative of this is also not entirely straightforward, so it does kind of necessitate some pretty close attention to detail. Like, it's not inscrutable or anything like that. I found it pretty easy to follow, despite it jumping from kind of character to character and time period to time period, which it does a little bit. But, people who prefer maybe more linear storytelling might find it a bit frustrating, so also know that going in. So on the surface, we seem to be following this lonely, kind of youngish to middle-aged man whose name is Ted Bannerman. And he lives in this kind of rundown house on the end of this dead-end street, Needless Street, obviously. Now, from the beginning, we know something is kind of off about Ted. Like, he comes across as extremely socially awkward, but he's also very sympathetic. But some of his conduct seems a tad sketchy, if not outright sinister. You know what I mean? So even from the beginning, like, the reader is pretty sure that things aren't entirely as they're being presented. Now, even though a couple of his neighbors seem pretty friendly toward him and seem to kind of like talk to him and try to bring him out of his shell and stuff, he's also had like rocks thrown through his windows and other vandalism kind of like perpetrated against him, because he's seen as something of like the town weirdo, you know what I mean? Near the beginning of the story, actually, this is kind of like a sad, like a bummer, because anytime there's anything bad happens to animals, and so you guys know how I get. But Ted is actually like really heartbroken when somebody in the neighborhood, you don't find out until later, like who it is, like very cruelly hides glue traps in all of his bird feeders, which kind of like, kills all the birds that he actually like loved watching. Now, it should be noted that some of the reason for the community's like hostility toward him has to do with the fact that he was a suspect in the disappearance of a little girl, like from a nearby lake, several years previously. Now, he was actually dismissed as a suspect, but people are still kind of like, because he's kind of a weirdo and he keeps to himself and everything like that. Now, Ted's parents are presumably dead, and he seems to have had a complicated relationship with them, especially his mom. She was a nurse that immigrated to the United States from a small village in France, and she had some interesting parenting techniques, to say the least. So we'll call it that. So the extent of her maybe like trauma generating behavior only kind of gets slowly unveiled, like as the book goes on, like through flashbacks and stuff. Now, in the present day, it seems like Ted's only friend is a very devoted, affectionate cat named Olivia. Yes, a cat. And actually, this book has several chapters written from the cat's perspective. I know that sounds kind of weird, but I mean, anybody who knows me, I love cats. I have 3 of them if you're new here. And I have to admit that the sections that are kind of from Olivia's point of view were pretty delightful. I really did like it. I was like, that's exactly what I imagined like a cat's thought processes would be. That's pretty awesome. But I will say that just like everything else in this novel, nothing is entirely as it appears. That's about as far as I'm going to go with that. Now, Ted also has a teenage daughter named Lauren, who is only in the house sometimes. You're kind of led to assume that she's with her mother the rest of the time, like maybe there was a divorce in the past or something, and she just comes to see Ted for visits, like weekly or every couple weeks or something like that. She's disabled, although they don't really tell you what the disability is until later on. But she's very rambunctious, and Ted really like dotes on her, but he's also real overprotective. And he's kind of like attempting to shield both her and Olivia the cat like from the dangers of the outside world. So some of the chapters are also from the daughter Lauren's perspective as well. However, as I previously alluded to, something is not entirely right about Ted. He drinks a lot, for one thing, and he has pretty frequent blackouts, like sometimes for days at a time, in which he says and does some pretty questionable things that he doesn't seem to remember, like when he comes back to himself. He also seems to believe that there are entities of some kind that he calls green boys up in his attic, and he never actually goes up in the attic. He also spends a lot of time in the woods next to his house with the gods, as he calls them, which are initially undisclosed objects that he keeps buried like in the woods, and that he seems to like revere quite highly, and like he has to move them around sometimes. There are also several instances throughout the novel where Ted, who's very lonely, like I said, and he's kind of longing for human companionship, he will use fake pictures like to make a profile on a dating site and set up meetings with various women. And you kind of see the beginning of some of these meetings, but you don't actually find out what happens with these dates until later on. Now, while all of this is going on with Ted, we're also following another character whose name is Dee. Now, Dee's 6-year-old sister, Lulu, vanished from a family trip to the nearby lake many years ago and has never been found. Now, Dee's mother abandoned the family shortly after this disappearance, and her father, I think he committed suicide, so Dee has kind of been dealing with her own trauma in that regard. So the only purpose kind of like remaining in her life is to find the person who took her sister. So for many years, I mean, she has been on like a single-minded pursuit to find this person, like since she's become an adult. And she also kind of has the grudging help of this police officer that she actually, I don't even know if they say the police officer's last name. She just calls her Tired Karen. So close to the start of the story, like after Dee has kind of run through this whole laundry list of suspects and sort of gotten nowhere, and there are actually references to some trouble she got into like in Oregon, like apparently like going after some other suspect. They don't really go into a lot of detail about what happened there, but the cop is just like, yeah, you don't want to do that shit again. So I guess she maybe did something to somebody that ended up not being the person. So she's kind of been going through suspects, not getting anywhere. So then she focuses her attention on Ted, who, like I said, was a person of interest in the disappearance back in the day, but was eventually cleared of suspicion. So Dee ends up renting the empty house next door to Ted's and starts like obsessively like surveilling him. And she's basically like searching just desperately for evidence that her missing sister is there, either dead or alive. So that's like about as far as I want to go in revealing like plot details, because I kind of feel like the appeal of this book is in just this constantly shifting mystery and, you know, it's changing perspectives. It's kind of fragmentary, sometimes almost dreamlike. Like, it's not surreal, or like I said, it's not real like obtuse or anything like that. It's not hard to follow, but it does have a little bit of that kind of style to it. But I mean, it's really never less than a very compelling story, because like new information keeps unfolding across like multiple avenues and multiple characters. Now, I will admit that I had begun to guess what the twist was likely to be and I was mostly correct when I got to it. But that didn't really diminish my enjoyment of the book overall. I mean, I was still interested to see how it was going to play out, how it was going to resolve itself, you know? So as I mentioned before, like the trope, the twist, or everything like that, it's been done a bunch of times before. So I feel like maybe some people might find it trite or disappointing or something like that. But I thought it worked really well in the context of this story. Now, although this is absolutely a horror novel, there's no other thing you could call it, it's also a pretty fascinating exploration of maybe like the lingering effects of trauma and the survival mechanisms that different people employ to deal with it. You know what I mean? You know, for better or for worse, like in everyone's situation. I'm not sure that I would go so far as to say that the novel deserved all of the hype it got. But I actually found it like pretty engrossing. Like I was really into it. And I'm actually sure I'll probably be thinking about its themes like for a while. So I really did like it quite a bit. So that will do it for this Tomes of Terror. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Remember to like and share and comment and all of that kind of stuff. And I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.